Good morning, and thank you for joining today with the ESSER Grant Management 101 guidance session that the Office of Public Instruction is putting forth for you. My name is Wendy Fons, and I'm the ESSER and EANS Director for the Office of Public Instruction in Montana. And this morning, we're going to go ahead and cover how to manage the ESSER grant specifically, but also all those techniques are available and usable for other grants as well. So I'm going to be kind of intermingling how using ESSER as an example, but also those same techniques can be used for other grants that you may have. As we go forward, feel free to put questions in the chat. There is about a 15-second delay time as you put those in before I see them, but feel free to put them in there. You can also send me an email afterwards. And on Friday, we have office hours, which will be available in the afternoon and via Zoom. So first of all, let's go ahead and move to the next slide. These are the goals for today. We're going to be talking about types of grants, why it's important to understand the significance of funding formulas, grant cycles, the compliances that are used. We'll talk a little bit about allowable and reasonable use of funds, although the majority of that, there is a separate guidance session that you can watch for that. And then we're going to talk a little bit about tracking expenditures and the outcomes and how that relates to the grant compliances. Next slide, please. So to start with, I want to explain that ESSER is a large grant, so it does carry with it all the requirements of a grant. And this is just a visual to give you an indication of the three grants under ESSER that we were as a state given. There was ESSER 1, CARES, and that expired this year. There was ESSER 2, which is CARISA, that expires in September of 23. And we had ESSER 3, ARP, which expires in 2024. And a significant amount of funding was provided across the United States. The sort of strange little square boxes on the right-hand side demonstrates how that funding was broken up in general. Next slide. So to start with the types of grants that we have. On the governmental side, we have federal grants, state grants. ESSER would be an example. I Graduate Montana would be another one. And all of those have governmental guidelines attached to them. Then we have foundational grants. Those are local, like the Steel Reeves or the RAP or Headwater, and they usually are geographically oriented, but not always. And they're national foundational grants, such as Rotary, Seroptimus, Masons, Elks, a lot of other grants in that foundation area of types of grants. And you can, of course, as a school district, pick up information or use grants from the governmental side as well as those from foundations. So you can actually have one program that uses both. So types of grants, again, are governmental and foundational. And then there are also these business or consortium type grants, like Blue Cross Blue Shield has a grant and Verizon has a grant. And those, again, are sort of these business grants that want to support education within different states where they provide services. And so they create a grant and different entities can apply for those. There are some hybrid grants which combine foundations as well as governmental. So for example, 4-H is part of the MSU Extension area, and it is a governmental grant, but it also has a foundation, a private foundation, and so they come together and work together in a hybrid mode. Many of these grants require matching funds and program partnerships, and that's really an important thing to understand in the grant cycles. So governmental grants, foundational grants, business and consortium grants, all of those often require some kind of a match or some kind of program partnership being demonstrated. Next slide, please. So when we look at the significance of funding formula and why that's important, I'm going to start with ESSER. So ESSER funds came through an identification of Title I and a formula. So the number of students that each district had identifies the amount of money that your district received. And then there are these mini grants like the summer and after school and homeless that also are looking at how funds are being allocated from the basis of a target or who those students are within the area that you serve. So it's looking at target population and that being part of the formula. So it's important when you look at applying for a grant or managing the grant, you want to know who the target is that they're allocating the funds for, because that's where the outcomes are going to want to be tracked. So the reporting at the end of the grant, which is always a compliance, will then look at who is being targeted and tracking what are the outcomes for that targeted population, or sometimes just counting the targeted population who participated. Next slide, please. When we look at a grant cycle, these are the things that are universally across all grants. So there's an application process, and you almost always need to go into some kind of a portal. And so you need an ID to get in. And there are very, very few grants anymore that are manual paper hard copy format. There are still some, but the vast majority require some kind of a username, some kind of a password, and you do have to get that prior to actually applying. All districts who received ESSER grants had that. So that's access into eGrants. That's the portal for our grant management software for ESSER. And then there's a notification that goes out. So that notification process tags into the portal or the application that has an email address. So it's very important for you to have the correct emails identified in the portal. So in eGrants, which is the Office of Public Instruction, it's the tool we use to manage grants. So districts need to make sure that those email addresses are correct. And then there's a performance period where you're actually managing the grant. And the things that you need within that part of the cycle are you really need a calendar to remind you, oh, these are the deadlines, these are the things I need to do for this particular grant. Often districts will set up reminders so that they're just maybe an Outlook and they say, oh, this report is due here. These are the things I need to do in eGrants. And then districts also usually have an Excel sheet of some form. So not an automated process, but an Excel tracking sheet to say, how am I spending the funds? How am I going to track at a more detailed level where those funds are being used and the outcomes? And then last in the reporting cycle, so you're managing the grant with these calendars, reminders, and Excel documents. But in the end, all of those get pulled together into a grant reporting and closeout. So there you need generally some kind of a reminder to tell you to do the closeout. And then you also need a Word document or the access to Word or Google Docs or something to that effect to write those reports. Sometimes those closeout reports are done within a software package that is administered through the Department of Admin, or through the Department of Education, or through OPI. So in the ESSER side of things, you are using a cash request process, final expenditure report through eGrants, and that's how that's done. If you're doing the after school and summer school or extended expanded learning opportunity grant, you are, in addition to doing an eGrants closeout, you are also doing a data reporting, which is coming through a Word document, a Google Doc survey type format. And if you're doing any private foundational grants, they may use Submittable or some other form to submit your final report. In some cases, like I Graduate Montana, those reports are just done in a Word document and you email it. So there are a variety of different closeout processes that are used, but all grants do have a closeout process or a cycle. Next slide, please. So as we look at grant compliances, this is kind of the meat of what are you doing when you're managing a grant. There is the application grant itself, and that really needs to be reviewed carefully against what are the requirements of the grant. So you want to go in addition to usually a portal that will say, question 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, you want to go back as you're answering those questions and really look at what is the basis for this grant? What are they targeting? Why are they giving these funds out? And ESSER is unusual. ESSER allows you to go in and modify that initial grant application. So you can go in an amendment and say, my first application said that I was going to use these funds this way. And now it's been 1.5 years in, and I've decided that that use of funds, while it was appropriate 1.5 years ago, it's not appropriate anymore, and I want to change the use of those funds. So you can actually go in and modify with an amendment that original application. When you do that, though, it's very important to go back and think, what is the guideline? Why are these funds being allocated to our district? And therefore, you want to look in the ESSER case to the prepare, prevent, and respond language and student gain. So those are the four things that this grant is really targeting. How is what you're changing in your application going to impact positively students? Specifically, what are their gains? And how does it relate to COVID? The prepare, prevent, respond. So those components need to be part of this change if you're going to change your application. They were part of the first application, but they also need to be part of that second change or additional changes that you may make. Again, in that regard, ESSER is a little different. Most grants that you would do for a foundation or you would do for other types of grants, it's a one-time shot. You say, here's what I'm going to use the funds for, and you need to use those funds in those pockets. Expenditure tracking. So you want to, in tracking how you're spending funds, you want to look at staff from a instructional standpoint, support administrative, curriculum, technology, supplies, maybe field trips, health, any of those needs that reach out to and tag into directly the goals of the grant. So again, looking at why was ESSER funding administered? Why was it given to you? And how does what you're doing relate to that? Participant tracking is also very important. And in that regard, ESSER is looking at who is attending in your school. If it's a mini grant of ESSER, if it's that summer programming time period or the after school time period, what students are participating in those activities, and the demographics of those students. This is one place where in the past, ESSER, the first two reports that we did for the Department of Education, really just asked how many students are participating in an event, and did you use yes or no funds for this category. So for example, in the first report that was required for, or the second report that was required for ESSER last spring, there might have been a question that said, did you use ESSER funds for technology? Yes or no? Did you have students participate in extended or expanded school opportunities? Yes or no? This year in the data collection that's going to be coming about shortly, there is much more likelihood that the Department of Education will ask more specifically how many students participated and to what capacity did you use the technology funds? Did you buy laptops? Did you buy integrated broadband access? Did you buy curriculum? So a more specific, how did you use those funds? Outcome measurements. Again, this is something to look at in terms of how are you're gaining these funds, you're using them. What is the outcome of those funds? What have you gained in terms of use of those funds? And communication on many grants is very important. So the ESSER has a very strong requirement that meaningful stakeholder input be part of the entire ESSER grant process. So it's not just a matter of sending to your board and having the board review the goals and priorities, and then the board signs off and says it's fine. It's making sure that the public has input, that maybe you send it out on Facebook to all the parents. Maybe you send home a flyer to the kids in elementary school. Maybe you host a pizza night, like you do FAFSA nights or something of that sort. Maybe you send out a text to say to your students and parents, on our website, we have posted our plans. If you have any input, this is what you need to do in order to give that input. Maybe you actually send out a manual mail, snail mail summary of how these funds have been used and what you plan to use the funds going forward in. So that communication is really, that meaningful stakeholder communication is very important in this grant. It is a compliance. It is not always a compliance on grants, but it is in the ESSER side of things. Lastly, there are these reporting requirements. And as I mentioned, there's the Department of Education requires an annual report be submitted on the use of funds. And then at the end of the report, end of spending, once you've spent all the funds, so like for ESSER 1, there was a final expenditure report that you needed to do. And that's saying all the funds have now been used and you're closing down that part of the grant. So that was that ESSER 1 CARES, which closed in September of 22. Next slide, please. So ESSER funding used to recover and innovate. And I think this is very important to understand that ESSER funding was used it was given as a recovery mode. It is COVID relief funding. It is an emergency funding umbrella. And it was also used to say during an emergency, we also have to do some innovative things to shore up our students who we know are going to have challenges coming back to school or challenges re-engaging in the institutional educational platform. We know that there were a significant number of students who were impacted when COVID happened. And so at that first, year and a half ago when COVID funding was first initiated, we did a lot of high touch components, phone calls, text, in-person visits. It was a campaign focused funding on attendance, trying to bring those students back. Some schools use student information systems. That's what that SIS is, or CRM, customer relations management software, to profile students to target those who were maybe most at risk of lost instructional time. And so how can we as teachers and administrators and staff really grab those students and help them re-engage? And now we're kind of beyond that point and we're looking at, okay, now we know those students, we can bring them back. We've got them back maybe. How are we going to shore up? How are we going to do these more intensive academic interventions? Because we know that they have occurred. How can we look at the recruitment and retention areas of our educational setting and workforce and ensure that those components are in place? We know that math and reading is a significant area that we need to draw some attention to. How are we going to use these funds in that capacity? And of course, looking continually at the overall health of each student and the family and the community. So sort of that first section, school focus on attendance, was sort of the first ESSER 1 focus. And now we're kind of looking at that second programming focus. It's not that both of those don't currently exist. It's just that there's a little bit greater emphasis on that second piece now as we move into the last year and a half of these ESSER 2 and 3 grant funding cycles. Next slide, please. So when we look at the specifics of ESSER right now and the compliance that are needed to be managed on the grant itself, we do need to look at, and notices have gone out with the safe return and the ARP plan. So those are two compliances that this grant requires. They're two separate plans. They have to be reviewed every 6 months or at least every 6 months. As I mentioned, they need to have meaningful stakeholder engagement. They need board approval, posted on the website with the school name and date last updated. So they're very specific requirements of those two plans. And this is a requirement of using the funds ESSER 2 and 3. Then there's that final report. So after you've spent all the funding, you go through and do a final expenditure report. So that's on the financial side. And then there's also tracking of expenditures and projects in order to do the federal data collection, which is going to be upcoming. And that's, if some of you were there last year, we did it last spring and we did it the spring before. Right now, we do not have guidance from the Department of Education as to when and what the full content of that data collection will be. Those of you who went through it last year know that it's quite a process. So we're getting prepared for that, but we haven't gotten specific direction from the Department of Ed as to what that will look like. As soon as we know, we will let you know. Next slide. So I want to show you two things in closing with regards to that expenditure and participation tracking. This was a slide, and again, we have under the eGrants, which is the portal under which this grant is managed at our side or at the state level. We have a longer video on eGrants preparing and processing the amendments and the cash request that was done in October. And this is a worksheet. We just did a snapshot of it that was created and used on a continual basis by Jolene she's a business clerk in Corvallis, and it's a very good way of tracking the expenditures. And she can go back then and use this tracking document that she adds things to all the time when she gets ready to do her data collection, the actual report. So she can pull information from this and then just plop it into amendments, cash requests, but also into those reports. And we do have that on our site. You can watch the video. You can also get a copy of the Excel workbook. She was gracious enough to share that out. Next slide, please. So this is a not so nice looking document. And this is actually 3 snapshots of the data collection that's given to us by the Department of Education. We have a review committee composed of some districts throughout our state who have looked at this process. And one of them said, well, if we printed this whole thing out, we couldn't have it across a table that held 12 people as a table runner. And there's some truth to that. It is very colorful, which is nice. It is in an Excel format, which we've gotten feedback is going to be probably the manner in which we're going to present this out. But it is a little challenging to interpret what the Department of Ed wants in each one of these categories. So what OPI is going to do is we are going to pull as much data as we can from reports that you already provide. So we're going through and we're going to pull the data on certain types of activities that you already report. Maybe it comes in through Infinite Campus. Maybe it comes in through Ames. Could be a number of different ways we receive it. And we're going to populate an Excel sheet that has all these wonderful colors in it. And then we're going to send that Excel sheet to you. And we're going to say, all right, this is what we see. This is what we think these items should be. Go ahead and let us know if it's correct or not. We're anticipating that to be about 70% of the Department of Education's ask on their annual report. And then there will be another 30% that we will not be able to pull answers for, and you will have to answer as well. Both of those reports will be in an Excel format. So we're hoping that that will be a manner in which you'll be familiar with already, and you'll be able to just type in the information from whatever source you use on your side. So if you think about grant compliance, and if we can go all the way back to the cycle. One more, I think. Yep, right there. So if we look at this, that performance period, that calendar, reminder in Excel, those are things to manage the grant that you really need on your side. They can be anything you want. If you don't want to use an Excel sheet to track, and you don't want to use Outlook as your reminder or a calendar, maybe you use a hard copy calendar, that's okay. You can use whatever mechanism you want to track internally. It's when we get to the point of grant reporting and closeout, that's where those things are really driven by the grantor themselves. And typically the grantor, whether it's the Department of Education at the federal level, or whether it is OCHI, which is determining at our state level the I Graduate Montana grant, they're the ones deciding how that information has to be presented into them. So again, it could be an Excel format, it could be through a portal, it could be through just sending an email with a Word document. It really varies. But it's important for you to have your internal mechanisms clear so that when you get ready to do the reporting, you are able to quickly fill in the blanks of what's needed. So I'm going to give you an example here of where that's important. Sometimes when you start a grant and you're managing a grant, you think, and we're looking at ESSER, you think, okay, I'm going to track how our money is being spent, but I'm not really, there's nothing that says in the grant that I need to know how many students are participating in each class. And later on, you get a report requirement that says you need to track the number of students who are in a math class. If you are using Infinite Campus, of course, you can go back and identify how many students are enrolled in geometry or algebra or at the high school level. You could go through and pull that information so you know internally how to use Infinite Campus if you're using that as your student information portal at the local level. If you have an Excel sheet for your summer school programming, maybe those providers who are doing summer school programming are already tracking. You know, they do a kids sign in the morning and kids sign out at in the afternoon. So maybe you've got those in hard copy, but you don't actually enter those into Excel or into anything else. But you have those hard copies. You can quickly convert those into an Excel sheet. So when you manage a grant, I think the thing that's important to understand is that there are a lot of pieces to keep track of. It's kind of accounting. And there's both sort of the count that's needed, and then there's also what are the student gains. So are you doing any kind of math testing pre and post to an after school program? And if you are receiving one of the after school, summer school, extended learning opportunity grants, there are specific requirements being asked to do a pre and post test. So you have to track those. On the ESSER grant, there wasn't that ask initially. There was not a here's the funding you can use based on the number of title students. We know that the target for that group was the at-risk students, as identified in a number of different ways, low income being one. But there wasn't an initial ask that said, well, your math scores are this pre-COVID, and we know they're going to go down during COVID, but then we're giving you this money to help you shore those up. And that's where we have to kind of look at how do we gain that data, tracking that. Typically districts, you have that. It just may not be in an Excel format, easy to pull. So you have to kind of think when you get to the last, and now if you want to go to the back slide again with all those wonderful colors in it. Thank you. One more up. Yep. If you look at here, there's some things that ask percentage of remaining funds that you're going to use on a particular thing. And then later on, there may be a place that says, what do you anticipate to gain, or what have you gained by using those funds? So let me pause here because this is a lot of information, and we'll just go to the last slide and say that we have all of these resources on our website under that ESSER link there on the far left, or not on the far left, I guess it's right in the middle. And you can always get the information on the recordings and other things there if you wish. But do we have any questions in the chat session right now? Okay, we're going to go ahead and stop the recording then. And if there are any questions that anyone has following this, feel free to just email those to me. You can also hop on, as I said, on Friday. We will have an open office hours. You can jump in there if you have some additional questions. Thank you very much for attending today.